Ever feel like maybe history class skipped a few chapters? We're going deep on this one. A look at World War II that might just turn what you thought you knew on its head.
Buckle up.
We're diving into Peter H. Nichols' Britain's Blunder.
A book that, let's just say it doesn't pull any punches.
Nichols' main argument that Britain, by declaring war on Germany back in '39, well, they made a colossal miscalculation.
A colossal mistake. And he jumps right in, dissecting the Treaty of Versailles, the one that's supposed to prevent another war.
Right, the war to end all wars.
Supposed to.
Yeah.
But Nicole argues, and this is really interesting, that it actually set the stage for World War II.
Okay, so break it down for us. What was so wrong with the treaty, according to Nichols?
Well, he points to the way Germany was treated, the terms. Really harsh. Take the war guilt clause, for example. Germany forced to accept full blame for the war.
Wow. Imagine the resentment, the bitterness. Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning. Then there were those massive reparations payments imposed on Germany,
crippling their economy.
Nicole argues that it created this perfect breeding ground for extremist ideologies, like Nazism. People are desperate, disillusioned, they're looking for answers.
So basically, by backing Germany into a corner, the Allies kind of inadvertently helped Hitler rise to power.
That's a major part of his argument. He's saying that while the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis were absolutely horrific, you can trace a lot of Hitler's actions back to the Treaty of Versailles, a reaction to the injustices as he saw them.
What goes around comes around, almost. But Nicole doesn't stop there. He digs even deeper and starts questioning some of the accepted narratives about Hitler.
He does. For example, were Hitler's demands for Danzig, for access to East Prussia, were those really just naked aggression? Or were they, at least in Hitler's mind, attempts to correct what he saw as the wrongs inflicted by that treaty?
Trying to reclaim what he believed was rightfully German, even if that belief was flawed.
Right. Nicole wants us to understand the context, the historical forces at play. Not to condone Hitler's actions, but to understand the factors that might have influenced his thinking.
It adds a layer of nuance, right, to a period we often see as very black and white.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more complex. Nicole highlights Hitler's attempts at negotiation, at appeasement.
Which isn't something we usually hear about.
No. We tend to focus on how World War II ultimately played out. But Nicole is suggesting that there might have been other paths, other ways to deal with Hitler that weren't taken.
Really makes you think. So we've got this flawed peace treaty, a leader driven by a desire for vengeance, and then enter Britain's guarantee to Poland.
Yes. Chamberlain's promise to defend Poland if Germany attacked.
The move that, at least according to many historians, was the tipping point, the thing that launched the world into war.
And Nicole. He calls it a reckless act, a promise that Britain couldn't keep. He even questions whether Britain had the right to dictate the foreign policy of another nation, essentially backing them into a corner.
And strategically, a blunder. Because could Britain really protect Poland from a German invasion?
That's what Nicole argues. He says they couldn't. And that this decision, this guarantee, was a fatal miscalculation with devastating consequences.
So it's not just the decision to go to war that Nicole criticizes. He also takes aim at Britain's conduct during the war, specifically how they treated neutral countries.
The Altmark incident is a prime example. That's where the British Navy boarded a German ship in Norwegian waters.
A neutral territory.
Exactly. Now, the Altmark, the ship in question, was carrying British prisoners of war.
Right.
But it was still a clear violation of Norway's neutrality. Even the British government eventually admitted that. Nicole uses this to illustrate what he sees as a pattern of hypocrisy in Britain's actions.
So the lines between the good guys and the bad guys weren't always so clear-cut.
That's his point.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets even more complicated when you look at the demand for unconditional surrender from Germany. Nicole argues this actually prolonged the war unnecessarily.
But at the time, wasn't that seen as the only way to ensure Germany wouldn't be able to start another war?
That was the thinking. But Nicole suggests it might have backfired. By pushing Germany to the brink, he argues, the Allies might have actually made it harder to achieve a negotiated peace, a peace that could have potentially ended the war sooner.
So forcing them into submission might have had the opposite effect. Interesting.
And his criticisms get even sharper when he gets to the alliance with the Soviet Union. He doesn't see it as some kind of partnership of shared values.
He uses some strong language, calling the Soviet Union a convenient ally or a greater threat. How does he back that up?
Well, he accuses the Allies of turning a blind eye to Soviet aggression, especially in places like Finland and the Baltic states. He's essentially saying that the Allies were willing to overlook Soviet atrocities while condemning similar actions by Germany.
And then there's the Katyn Forest massacre. Thousands of Polish officers executed by the Soviets. Nicole argues this was deliberately covered up to maintain the alliance.
His point is that the wartime alliance wasn't as simple as we often think. He's arguing that in their focus on defeating Nazi Germany, the Allies might have inadvertently empowered another regime, one that went on to threaten the very freedoms they claimed to be fighting for.
We're back! And man, Nicole, he just keeps going.
Yeah.
We're really getting into some thought-provoking stuff in Britain's blunder here,
Yeah.
especially about what went down after the war ended.
He does not hold back.
Yeah.
And this is where his argument about the whole be careful what you wish for thing when it comes to Britain's actions, it gets really, really stark. Nicole is seriously critical of how the Allies, particularly Britain, treated Germany in those post-war years, like the whole occupation period.
Yeah, he does not paint a pretty picture. I remember reading about all that stuff about how they just dismantled German industry.
Right, and he's saying that wasn't just about demilitarization, making sure they couldn't wage war. He sees it as this deliberate attempt to just crush Germany's economy, to rewind their industrial progress and eliminate them as any kind of threat in the future.
So it's almost like more than just winning the war. They wanted to fundamentally change Germany's place in the world.
That's exactly what Nicole argues. He even compares it to the way ancient Rome dealt with Carthage. You completely obliterate a defeated enemy so they can never challenge you again.
Wow. And he ties this directly to the Soviet Union. How's that work?
This is a huge part of his whole thesis, actually. Nicole says that by creating this power vacuum in Europe after the war, the Allies basically paved the way for the Soviets to swoop in and expand their own influence.
So, they created the problem they were trying to prevent.
That's the argument. And it's not just the economic policies either. He's also really critical of the whole denazification program.
Which, that was a massive undertaking, right? Trying to root out all those Nazi influences.
Huge. And Nicole thought it was deeply flawed. Now, obviously, he's not defending Nazism, but he says the Allies went way overboard in trying to purge every single trace of it from German society.
How do you even begin to do that?
Right. And that's his point. Nicole says that by targeting anyone who had any position of authority under the Nazi regime, like teachers, doctors, lawyers, even low-level officials, they created this massive leadership vacuum.
So even if those people weren't hardcore Nazis, they were still out of a job, leaving Germany with no one to run things.
Exactly. And at a time when they desperately needed experienced people to rebuild, Nicole argues that this vacuum was often filled with people who were unqualified or even opportunistic, more interested in settling scores than actually fixing things. And he says this just made Germany's recovery that much harder and fueled resentment toward the Allies.
So it's like they tried to create this perfectly clean society but ended up making things worse.
It's a really complex argument. And it's tied to this other point Nicole makes about the Allies being so gung-ho about imposing democracy on Germany.
He has a problem with that. I mean, spreading democracy sounds like a good thing, especially after a war against a totalitarian regime.
Sure. But Nicole says true democracy can't be forced on people. It has to come from within. He suggests that the Allies' efforts, probably well-intentioned, were ultimately just superficial. He even calls it hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy? How so?
Well, he points to how the Allies were perfectly willing to overlook Soviet oppression in Eastern Europe while they were busy demanding these democratic reforms in Germany.
So they weren't really championing democracy as this universal ideal, more like they were using it as a tool to reshape Germany in their own image.
Exactly. And that leads back to Nicole's main point about the unintended consequences of everything Britain did. He argues that instead of creating this stable and democratic world, the Allies actually, through their policies in Germany, made the world more divided, more unstable, more likely to fall into conflict.
With the Cold War being the most obvious example.
Right. Nicholl sees the Cold War as a direct result of the Allies failing to create a real, lasting peace in Europe. He says the seeds of that conflict were sown in the way they treated defeated Germany.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, right? The victors, even as they were trying to rebuild, might have accidentally set the stage for a whole new era of global tension.
Totally. But that's what's so fascinating about Nicholl's book. He doesn't just criticize. He makes you confront all these really thorny questions about history, about morality, about the very real possibility that even good intentions can have terrible consequences. And speaking of thorny questions, let's get into his analysis of the Nuremberg trials.
Oh, yeah. He does not hold back on those. Yeah, he really goes in on them. Calls them a farce, if I remember correctly.
He's super critical of the whole idea of victor's justice. Like the winners get to make the rules and punish the losers, but was it really fair?
And he points out that some of the stuff the Nazi leaders were accused of, it wasn't even against the law when they did it.
Exactly. He's talking about how the Allies basically invented these new legal concepts after the war was over, like crimes against humanity, and then they applied those retroactively. Nagel says that totally undermines the whole point of a fair trial.
Right, how can you be guilty of something that wasn't a crime at the time?
Right. And he also has a big problem with who was on the court at Nuremberg. He says it was inherently biased against the Germans.
Well, yeah, I mean, all the judges were from the Allied countries.
Exactly. Nicole argues that there's no way they could be truly impartial, right? I mean, they'd seen the horrors of the Nazi regime firsthand. Their countries had suffered devastating losses because of Germany.
Plus, he says they were totally willing to overlook atrocities committed by the Soviets. It's that hypocrisy thing again, right?
100%. Holding Germany to a standard they didn't even apply to themselves or their allies. And for Nicole, this all ties back to his criticism of the entire Allied vision for the post-war world.
Okay, so how does that work?
He says that by putting so much emphasis on punishment, on revenge, instead of trying to, reconcile and rebuild, they actually made the Cold War more likely.
So their actions had the opposite of the intended effect.
That's what he's arguing. Trying to make the world safe and punish the people responsible for the war actually created an even more unstable and dangerous world.
Wow. So Nichols' book, it's not just some dry history lesson, is it? It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about World War II. About good guys and bad guys, about what victory really costs.
And that's what makes Britain's blunder so compelling, He's not just giving us a different version of events. He's challenging us to rethink some really basic assumptions about one of the most important periods in history.
It reminds us that history is about more than just dates and battles. It's about how we interpret those events, the questions we ask, and how we try to understand the past.
Nichols' book is a call to action. He wants us to question the narratives we've been told and search for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the past.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the big question isn't whether you agree with everything Nichols says. It's about the questions he raises.
Right, like what were the real consequences of Britain's choice to go to war? Could things have gone differently? Did the victors actually create more problems than they solved?
These are questions we're thinking about, and they're relevant not just to understanding the past, but the world we live in today.
So keep asking those tough questions. Keep exploring different points of view. Keep diving deep. It's the only way to really understand the complexities of history.